It was a cold evening. The sky was heavy with clouds, and the city lights looked like tiny stars lost in smoke. The streets were almost empty, except for the sound of distant traffic and the soft hum of streetlights. A shiny black car turned into a narrow, broken road, a road that most people avoided after dark. Inside the car sat Sophie, a woman in her early 30s. Her face looked calm, but her eyes showed something else: pressure, tiredness, and worry. She was not just anyone. She was the CEO of a big company. People usually saw her in meetings, giving orders and talking about millions of dollars. But tonight, she was alone and lost in a place she had never been before. Her phone's GPS kept repeating, "Turn right in 100 meters." She frowned. "This doesn't look right," she whispered to herself. The buildings around her looked old and cracked. Some windows had no glass, only shadows behind curtains. A group of men stood near a corner, smoking and watching her car slowly pass. Their eyes followed her, and Sophie's heart started beating faster. Her phone battery showed 3%. She wanted to call someone, but the signal was weak. "Come on." "Not now," she muttered, tapping the screen. The car engine made a strange noise, then stopped. She tried again, but it didn't start. The fuel light blinked red. Her chest tightened with fear. Outside, the street was silent except for distant music coming from somewhere far away. Sophie looked around, locking her car doors. She tried to stay calm, but her hands were shaking. This wasn't the kind of place she belonged in. Her expensive clothes, her diamond watch, they made her stand out too much. She whispered to herself, "Stay calm, Sophie. Someone will come, just stay calm." Minutes passed. The street grew darker. Her phone finally died. The last light from the screen disappeared, leaving her face in shadow. That's when she saw movement, a man walking down the road with a small girl beside him. He was carrying a grocery bag and holding the girl's hand tightly. His clothes were simple, worn out but clean. He looked tired, but his steps were steady. The little girl had 2 small ponytails and was humming a song softly. Sophie's first thought was fear. Who are they? Are they safe? She lowered her window just a little, watching them carefully. The man noticed her car and stopped. He looked at her with concern, not curiosity. Then slowly, he walked closer, keeping his daughter behind him. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a calm voice. "Are you okay? Your car seems stuck." Sophie didn't answer right away. Her first instinct was to stay silent. But then she saw the little girl peek from behind him, her eyes wide and innocent. Sophie took a small breath and replied, "My car stopped. I think it ran out of fuel, and my phone died." The man nodded. "Ah, that's bad. This area isn't safe at night." His voice was gentle but serious. "Do you need help?" Sophie hesitated. She didn't like asking strangers for help. In her world, people always wanted something in return. But this man's eyes were different, tired, honest, not greedy. "Can I borrow your phone?" she asked softly. "Sure," he said, handing her an old, cracked phone. "But I'm not sure it'll have much signal here." She tried to call her driver, but the call didn't go through. She tried again. Still nothing. The little girl looked up at her and asked innocently, "Are you scared, miss?" Sophie froze for a moment. No one had talked to her like that in years. She smiled weakly. "A little bit, yes," the man chuckled quietly. "She asks too many questions." "Sorry about that." "My name's Ethan, by the way. And this is Mia," Sophie nodded. "I'm Sophie." Ethan looked down the dark street. "It's not safe to wait here. There's a main road about 20 minutes away. We can walk with you there if you want. Taxis pass by sometimes." Sophie looked at the dark road, then at the quiet houses around. She didn't see any other choice. "Okay," she said after a pause. "Thank you." She stepped out of the car, feeling the cold air hit her face. Her heels made small sounds on the wet ground. Ethan walked beside her, holding Mia's hand. He made sure to stay a few steps ahead, giving her space, a small gesture of respect. As they walked, Sophie kept looking around nervously. Every sound made her heart jump: a barking dog, a door creaking, footsteps echoing. Ethan noticed her fear. "Don't worry," he said gently. "We'll be out of this street soon. Just stay close." The streetlights flickered. The little girl kept humming softly. The sound felt strangely comforting. Sophie felt her fear slowly turning into something else, a quiet curiosity. Who was this man walking beside her, helping her without knowing anything about her? Why did he seem so calm, so kind in such a rough place? For years, Sophie had lived in a world where everyone wanted something, power, money, advantage. But Ethan, he didn't even ask who she was. He just saw someone in need. They turned another corner, the night getting darker around them. Sophie glanced at Ethan again. His face looked tired but peaceful. He smiled at his daughter every few seconds, as if she was the only light he needed in his life. Sophie's heart softened a little. She didn't know it yet, but this night, this wrong street would change everything she believed about people. And about herself. The camera would slowly fade out here, with the sound of their footsteps echoing under the weak streetlights. The night felt colder as they walked deeper into the narrow streets. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp, and the smell of smoke and dust mixed together. Sophie wrapped her arms around herself, trying to hide her fear. Ethan walked calmly beside her, holding his daughter's hand tightly. He didn't talk much, but his quietness felt safe. The little girl, Mia, skipped a little, humming a small tune. Every few steps, she looked up at Sophie with her big, curious eyes. "Miss Sophie," she said softly, "why were you alone in such a scary place?" Sophie smiled a little. "I took a wrong turn. My GPS led me here." Mia frowned. "GPS should be punished," she said seriously. Ethan laughed quietly, and Sophie couldn't help but smile too. For a moment, the fear faded away. She looked around again. Small houses with broken lights, a few people sitting outside talking softly, and children playing barefoot in the mud. Life here looked so different from her world, yet somehow it felt real. Ethan pointed ahead. "There's a small shop a few minutes away. Maybe they have a landline phone. You can try calling someone from there." Sophie nodded. "That would help, thank you." As they walked, Sophie's shoes slipped slightly on the wet road. Ethan noticed and said, "Careful, these streets are uneven." He offered his hand, but Sophie hesitated for a moment before taking it. His hand was rough, strong, warm, so different from the polished businessman she met every day. "You work around here?" she asked. He nodded. "Yeah, I work at a repair shop during the day and drive for deliveries at night. Got to keep things going for her." He smiled at his daughter. Sophie looked at him quietly. "That must be hard," he shrugged. "It's life. Hard times teach you how strong you really are." His words stayed in her mind. She'd spent years chasing success, power, and money. Yet this man, with so little, spoke with more peace than she'd ever felt. When they reached the small shop, Ethan knocked on the metal shutter. It was half closed. An old man peeked out. "Uncle Raj, it's me, Ethan," he said. "This lady's car broke down. Can she use your landline?" The old man nodded, letting them in. The shop smelled of spices and old wood. Sophie picked up the landline phone, but the line was dead. The old man sighed. "Phone's been down since evening. Maybe in the morning." Sophie thanked him and stepped outside again. Her hope was fading. The streets were even darker now. Ethan looked around. "Main road is still far, but if we keep walking, we'll reach a bus stop." "You can get a taxi from there," Sophie nodded. "I'm sorry I'm troubling you." Ethan shook his head. "No trouble. You'd do the same if it was me, right?" She hesitated before answering. "I hope so." Inside, she knew she wasn't sure. She had spent years behind office walls, too busy to care for strangers. As they walked again, the little girl suddenly pointed at the sky. "Daddy, look, the moon." Sophie looked up. The clouds had moved, and a thin silver moon shone above the rooftops. For a brief moment, the whole street seemed softer. "You two live around here?" Sophie asked. "Yes," Ethan said. 3 blocks down. My daughter and I moved here after her mother passed away." Sophie stayed silent. She didn't know what to say, but she felt something heavy in her heart. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Ethan nodded. "Thank you. It's been 2 years now. We're doing okay." They walked in silence for a while. The sound of their footsteps and the little girl's soft humming filled the air. Sophie kept glancing at Ethan, his face calm, his eyes steady. He walked like a man used to pain, but still hopeful. Suddenly, a group of teenagers shouted from a corner, laughing loudly. Sophie froze, clutching her bag tighter. Ethan immediately moved slightly in front of her, keeping Mia behind him. "It's fine," he whispered. "Ignore them." They passed quickly. One of the boys said something rude, but Ethan didn't respond. He kept walking, his shoulders stiff. Sophie felt safe, not because of where she was, but because of who was walking beside her. She whispered, "Thank you." He smiled slightly. "You're welcome." After a while they reached a small park. The benches were wet and a broken streetlight flickered. Ethan stopped. "We can rest for a minute if you want. You look tired." Sophie didn't argue. She sat down, taking a deep breath. The silence of the night surrounded them. Mia opened her small lunchbox and took out a cookie. She walked to Sophie and held it out. "You can have it," she said. Sophie blinked, surprised. "That's yours." "It's okay. Daddy says sharing is kind," Mia said proudly. Sophie smiled, taking the cookie carefully. Her throat felt tight. "Thank you, sweetheart." She hadn't been called sweetheart since her mother died years ago. That small word hit her heart deeply. Ethan watched them quietly, his eyes soft. "She likes helping people," he said. "She's a good kid," Sophie replied. "She is," Ethan said proudly. "She's my whole world." The clock in the park showed 11:45 p.m. Sophie sighed. "I didn't expect my night to turn out like this." Ethan smiled. "Life's funny that way. Sometimes you find good people in bad places." Sophie looked at him, truly looked at him this time. His kindness, his calm voice, his care for his daughter. It all felt real, something she hadn't seen in a long time. As they started walking again toward the main road, Sophie glanced back once more at her expensive car left behind in the dark. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like the CEO everyone respected. She just felt human, lost, cold, but strangely comforted. Ethan didn't know her name fully. He didn't know what company she owned or how powerful she was. All he knew was that a woman needed help, and he helped. But deep inside Sophie's heart, something had already begun to change. A small, quiet spark that would soon turn into something far bigger than she could ever imagine. The night grew darker, and the air turned colder. The small park was behind them now, and Sophie, Ethan, and little Mia walked slowly through the quiet streets. The sound of their footsteps echoed softly. There was no traffic, no lights, only the dim glow from old street lamps and the whisper of the wind moving through narrow alleys. Sophie held her bag close, her breath visible in the cold air. Her feet hurt from her high heels, but she didn't complain. She didn't want to look weak. Ethan noticed, though. He slowed down his pace so she could keep up. "You okay?" he asked gently. She nodded. "Yes, just a little tired." "Not used to walking this much, huh?" he said with a small smile. Sophie smiled faintly back. "You could say that." Mia skipped ahead a few steps, her small shoes splashing in tiny puddles. "Daddy, when will we reach the main road?" she asked. "Soon, sweetheart," Ethan said. "Just a few more turns." Sophie looked at them, father and daughter walking together, sharing small moments in the middle of the night, as if danger and darkness didn't exist for them. Something about it touched her heart. She had grown up rich, surrounded by people, yet she couldn't remember the last time she had felt this kind of warmth. To break the silence, she asked, "Do you always walk home this late?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah, after my evening shift. I finish around 10, then we stop by the shop to get groceries." He lifted the small paper bag in his hand. "It's not much, but we manage." Sophie looked at him curiously. "You work 2 jobs?" He nodded again. "Got to keep things running. Mia's school fees, rent bills, you know how it is." She didn't, actually. She never had to think twice about money. But hearing it from him made her realize how different their worlds were. As they walked, the wind picked up, making the street signs rattle. Sophie rubbed her hands together. Ethan noticed and said, "Here, you can wear my jacket if you want." She shook her head quickly. No, it's okay. You need it more. But Mia tugged her father's arm. Daddy, she looks cold. You should give it to her. Ethan smiled softly and handed his old brown jacket to Sophie. She hesitated again, but then accepted it. Thank you, she said quietly. No problem, he replied. It's just a jacket. But for Sophie, it wasn't just a jacket. It was kindness, something she rarely received without a hidden reason behind it. They kept walking, and Ethan began to tell Mia a small story about a lost cat who found her home by following the moonlight. Sophie listened silently. His voice was calm, gentle, the kind of voice that could make you forget the noise of the world. Mia laughed softly when her father imitated the cat's meow. Sophie couldn't help but smile again. You tell stories often? She asked. Every night, Ethan said. Helps her sleep. Sometimes helps me too. Sophie chuckled softly. You're good at it. Thanks, he said. I used to read them from books, now I just make them up. They passed a small house with lights still on. Through the window, Sophie saw a family eating dinner together, laughing. She looked away quickly. It reminded her of how lonely her life had become. Her success had cost her peace. Her money had cost her warmth. After a while, Ethan asked, So, what do you do, Miss Sophie? Sophie froze for a second. The question hit her unexpectedly. She couldn't tell him the truth, not now, not when she knew how people looked at her kind. I work in an office, she said. He nodded. Office job, huh? Must be nice. Warm, safe, good pay. Sophie forced a smile. Yeah, it's fine. Inside, she felt something strange. Guilt. Here was a man walking through dangerous streets every night for his daughter, and she couldn't even tell him who she really was. As they turned another corner, the road became rougher. A group of stray dogs barked from a distance. Sophie flinched, and Ethan moved closer, protectively. Don't worry, he said, they won't come near us. She looked at him and realized he wasn't just kind, he was brave. A few minutes later, the sound of a broken radio came from a nearby house. A man inside was singing an old love song. The melody drifted through the air. Ethan smiled. My wife loved that song, he said softly. Sophie looked at him gently. She must have had good taste. He laughed quietly. Yeah, she did. There was a long silence after that. Only their footsteps and the song in the background filled the air. Sophie wanted to ask more, but she could see the pain behind his smile. Finally, she said, You love your daughter a lot. Ethan looked down at Mia, who was now walking beside him, holding his hand tightly. She's everything, he said simply. When you lose someone you love, you realize how precious what's left truly is. His words hit Sophie deep inside. For years, she had lost pieces of herself to money, to pressure, to loneliness. Maybe she had more than most people, but she felt emptier than ever. The main road was still far, but the air felt lighter now. The fear was gone, replaced by something new, understanding. Ethan asked, When someone finds you, will they come pick you up from the main road? Yes, she said. My driver or maybe a colleague. They must be worried. Good, he said. I'll wait until they do. Sophie looked at him again. You don't have to. You've already done enough. Ethan smiled. Helping someone doesn't need a reason. It's just what people should do. Those simple words stayed in her mind as they kept walking. For the first time, Sophie didn't feel like a CEO. She felt like a person learning how kindness really works, not through business meetings or charity events, but through a stranger with a big heart and a small daughter who believed in sharing cookies. As they turned the last corner before the bus stop, Sophie looked up at the stars peeking through the clouds. Something inside her whispered that this walk wasn't an accident. It was the start of something that would change her forever. The walk toward the main road felt endless. The air was heavy, and dark clouds slowly began to cover the sky again. The streetlights flickered weakly, and a cold wind brushed against Sophie's face. Ethan looked up and sighed. "Looks like rain again," he said. Before Sophie could answer, a loud crack of thunder rolled across the sky. Within seconds, raindrops started to fall, first slowly, then faster. "Oh no!" Mia cried, laughing as she tried to cover her head with her hands. Ethan quickly pulled his daughter close and looked around for shelter. "There," he pointed, "under that old shop roof." They ran toward a small abandoned building with a rusted metal roof. The rain poured harder, bouncing off the ground. The three of them stood under the narrow shelter, breathing heavily from the short run. Sophie's hair was wet, her makeup fading, but she didn't care. She looked at the heavy rain falling in sheets. The sound was loud, like 1,000 small drums beating on the metal above them. Ethan placed the grocery bag on the ground and took off his jacket again, putting it around Mia's shoulders. Then he noticed Sophie shivering slightly. Without a word, he pulled out an old towel from the bag and offered it to her. "You'll catch a cold," he said. Sophie smiled softly. "You think of everything, don't you?" He shrugged. "You learn when you're a single parent." She looked at him. Really looked. His shirt was soaked, his hair wet, yet his face stayed calm. There was strength in his simplicity, a quiet peace she couldn't explain. The little girl giggled as she tried to catch raindrops with her small hands. "Daddy, look, the rain feels happy." Ethan laughed gently. "Yeah, maybe the sky is dancing." Sophie smiled at the scene. She hadn't smiled genuinely like that in years. Watching Ethan and Mia laugh together felt like watching a small light in the middle of a dark night. After a few minutes, Ethan took out a small chocolate bar from his pocket. It was slightly wet, but still wrapped. He broke it into 3 pieces and handed one to each of them. Mia looked at Sophie and said sweetly, "You have to eat, Miss Sophie. It will make you feel better." Sophie took it slowly. "Thank you, Mia. You're very kind." Mia grinned. "Daddy says kindness is free. We can give it to everyone." Ethan smiled proudly, watching his daughter. Sophie's chest felt heavy again, not from sadness, but from realization. In her world, nothing was free. Everything had a price: time, loyalty, friendship. But here, under a broken roof in the rain, a stranger and his little girl were giving her everything she'd been missing. The rain kept falling harder. Sophie wrapped Ethan's jacket tighter around her. "You really walk home in weather like this?" "Most days, yes," he said. "Sometimes it rains, sometimes it's too hot, but we don't have much choice." She looked down. "That must be hard." He nodded slightly. "It is. But when I see Mia smiling, it makes everything easier." Sophie followed his eyes, the way he looked at his daughter, full of love and pride, even when life was difficult. It made her think of her own parents, who she barely saw anymore. She couldn't even remember the last time she'd laughed with them. A strong gust of wind blew rain onto their faces. Ethan quickly moved closer to block the wind from hitting Sophie and Mia. His simple act made Sophie's heart skip a beat. She wasn't used to people protecting her without expecting something in return. They stood quietly for a while, listening to the rhythm of the rain. The air smelled like wet earth and peace. Then Mia looked up at Sophie and asked, "Do you have kids?" Sophie shook her head. "No, I don't." "Then you must get lonely sometimes," Mia said softly. Sophie didn't answer at first. The little girl's words hit her deeply. She looked down, forcing a smile. "Maybe a little." Ethan watched her, sensing that her silence had more meaning. "You must have a busy job," he said kindly, trying to change the subject. "Yes," she said quickly. "Very busy. Meetings, travel, people calling me all day." "Sounds tiring," he said. "It is," she admitted. "Sometimes I forget what peace feels like." Ethan looked at the rain again. "Peace doesn't come from what we have. It comes from who we share it with." His words were simple, but they went straight to her heart. She turned her face away, not wanting him to see her eyes tearing up. For a long time, none of them spoke. Only the sound of the rain filled the silence. Then Ethan began to hum, a soft tune, slow and gentle. Sophie turned to him. "That song, it's beautiful." He smiled faintly. It was my wife's favorite. She used to sing it when she cooked. Sophie hesitated. She's not here anymore? He shook his head. No, she passed away 2 years ago. Mia looked down sadly. Mummy's in heaven now. Sophie's heart broke a little. She looked at Ethan. His face was calm, but his eyes carried pain that no words could hide. I'm sorry, she whispered. Thank you, he said softly. Life moves on. I just try to make sure Mia remembers her mother, with smiles, not tears. Sophie's eyes filled with tears she quickly wiped away. For a moment, she saw her own reflection in them, a woman who had everything, yet nothing that truly mattered. The rain began to slow down. Drops became lighter, and the sound turned softer, almost peaceful. Ethan looked outside. We can go now. It's almost clear. Sophie nodded silently. She didn't know what to say. Something inside her had shifted. The cold she felt when her car broke down was gone, replaced by warmth, by something she couldn't describe. They stepped out from under the roof, water dripping from their clothes. The street smelled fresh after the rain. Sophie looked at Ethan and Mia walking ahead of her, father and daughter hand in hand, and she realized that maybe fate had brought her here for a reason. Ethan turned back and said, Come on, Miss Sophie. The main road is close. Sophie smiled softly. I'm right behind you. As they walked under the faint moonlight, the camera could fade slowly, rainwater reflecting their 3 shadows on the ground. A woman who had everything, walking beside a man who had nothing. Yet somehow he was richer than she could ever be. The rain had finally stopped. The night air was cool and quiet, and the street glistened with puddles reflecting the dim yellow lights above. Sophie, Ethan, and Mia walked slowly now, their shoes making soft splashes with every step. Ethan carried the grocery bag in one hand, while Mia held his other hand tightly. Sophie walked beside them, lost in thought. Her heart still felt heavy from the story Ethan had shared about his wife, about the life he'd built from loss. They reached a small roadside tea stall, still open despite the late hour. The old man behind the counter smiled. Ethan, out late again, huh? Ethan nodded politely. Yeah, had to help someone who got lost. The man chuckled. You and your kind heart, always helping strangers. Ethan smiled, then turned to Sophie. Would you like some tea? It's warm. Sophie hesitated but nodded. Yes, that would be nice. They sat on an old wooden bench under a plastic shade. The smell of wet earth mixed with the steam of hot tea. For a few moments, everything felt peaceful again. Mia sipped her tea carefully, blowing on it to cool it down. Sophie smiled at her, feeling something strange, something close to affection. Ethan took a sip and looked at the road ahead. You know, I used to bring my wife here all the time, he said quietly. She loved this place. She said the tea tasted like home. Sophie listened silently. She didn't want to interrupt. She could feel the weight behind his words. One night, he continued, we were walking home from here. She was holding my hand, laughing about something silly. Then a car came out of nowhere. Drunk driver. Didn't even stop. Sophie froze. Her cup trembled slightly in her hands. Ethan's voice stayed calm, but his eyes turned distant. She died right there on the road, he said softly. In my arms. The silence that followed was painful. The sound of the rain dripping from the roof was the only thing between them. Sophie looked down, her throat tight. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Ethan nodded slowly. The police came. The driver was from a big company. Powerful people. They said they'd handle it, but nothing happened. Case closed in weeks. He took a slow breath. I tried fighting for justice. But when you're poor, your voice doesn't reach far. His tone was calm, but his eyes said everything. Pain, anger, and quiet acceptance. Sophie felt her heartbeat grow faster. A big company. Drunk driver. Case closed. Her mind began to race. Her company had once dealt with a case like that, 2 years ago. An employee from her own firm had hit a woman while driving drunk. The company's lawyers had covered it up quickly to protect the brand. She had signed the report herself. Her hands went cold. Her heart sank. She looked at Ethan, this simple, kind man who had helped her without knowing who she was, and realized with horror his wife's death was connected to her company. She tried to steady her breathing. No, it can't be the same case. There must be hundreds like it. But her gut told her the truth. Ethan didn't notice her silence. He was busy wiping the rain off Mia's hair. Anyway, he said with a soft smile, we learned to live again. I couldn't let anger eat me up. I had to stay strong for her. He looked at Mia, who smiled back, not fully understanding her father's pain. Sophie stared at them, guilt building inside her like a storm. She wanted to speak, to say sorry, to tell him the truth, but the words wouldn't come out. How could she? What would he think if he knew? He looked at her and said, sorry, I didn't mean to make things heavy. It's just, sometimes talking helps. She forced a smile. No, it's okay. You can talk. I'm listening. He nodded and took another sip of tea. You remind me of her a little, he said suddenly. Sophie blinked. Really? Yeah, Ethan said, smiling faintly. You both have the same way of thinking before you speak. Same quiet look in the eyes. Sophie looked away quickly, pretending to watch the road. She didn't want him to see the tears forming in her eyes. She whispered, you must miss her every day. Ethan nodded. Every single one. Mia tugged his sleeve. Daddy, Mommy used to say the rain means she's watching us, right? Ethan smiled at his daughter. Yes, sweetheart. Maybe she's happy we met a new friend tonight. Sophie swallowed hard. If only he knew who that friend really was. The old man at the tea stall called out, It's late, Ethan. Take care on your way home. Ethan nodded. Thanks, Uncle. He turned to Sophie. Come on, Miss Sophie. The main road's just ahead. They walked in silence again. The night was quiet, but Sophie's mind was loud, filled with guilt, regret, and confusion. Each step felt heavier than the last. Ethan walked beside her, talking softly to his daughter, unaware that the woman next to him carried the truth about his wife's death. When they finally reached the end of the narrow street, the bright lights of the main road came into view. Cars passed by fast, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Sophie could see her driver standing near a black car, searching for her. Looks like someone came for you, Ethan said with a small smile. Sophie nodded slowly. Yes, that's my driver. He gave a short laugh. Good. You'll be safe now. Sophie turned to him, her eyes wet. Ethan. He looked at her kindly. Yeah? She opened her mouth to speak, to tell him the truth, but her voice broke. Thank you. For everything, he smiled. You don't have to thank me. Just promise me one thing. What's that? She asked softly. If you ever see someone lost like you were tonight, help them. That's how kindness grows. Her throat tightened. She nodded, unable to speak. As she stepped toward her car, the driver opened the door and said loudly, Miss Sophie, the board meeting was worried, ma'am. Are you okay? Ethan froze. Miss Sophie? She turned slowly, her heart pounding. He looked confused. You're the Sophie Turner, the CEO. She stood silently under the streetlight, the truth shining brighter than the light itself. Ethan's expression changed. Not anger, but shock, disappointment, and realization. You, he whispered. Sophie looked down, tears falling silently. She wanted to explain, to say sorry, but the words stayed trapped inside. Mia waved at her innocently. Goodbye, Miss Sophie. Sophie forced a smile through her tears. Goodbye, sweetheart. The driver closed the car door, and the black car drove away into the night. Ethan stood still, his daughter holding his hand, the rain-soaked road shining around them. For Sophie, that ride back home felt longer than any road she'd ever taken. Because now, she wasn't just lost in a bad street, she was lost in her own guilt. The car moved silently through the city streets. Inside, Sophie sat by the window, her eyes fixed on the dark blur outside. Her driver kept talking, but she didn't hear a single word. All she could hear was Ethan's voice. You're the CEO! Echoing in her head again and again. Each time she blinked, she saw his face. The moment when shock turned into pain. She pressed her fingers against her forehead. Her chest felt tight, her throat dry. For years, she had hidden behind power and papers, thinking that every decision she made was just business. But tonight, those papers had names. Those numbers had faces, and one of them was Ethan's wife. The driver looked at her through the mirror. Ma'am, should I take you home? She nodded weakly. Yes, home. When the car stopped at her mansion gate, the guards rushed to open the door. But Sophie didn't move. She sat still, staring at her reflection in the window, a reflection she didn't recognize anymore. Her reflection looked powerful, rich, successful, but all she felt inside was guilt and emptiness. Finally, she stepped out, heels clicking softly on the wet stones. The air smelled of rain and flowers, but to her it felt heavy, almost suffocating. Inside the house, the lights were warm and golden. Her assistant ran toward her. "Ma'am, you missed the late meeting. The board is—" "Cancel everything," Sophie said in a quiet voice. The assistant blinked. "Ma'am?" I said, "Cancel everything. No meetings, no calls. Just leave me alone." The assistant hesitated, then nodded and left. Sophie walked upstairs, her wet hair falling over her shoulders. She stopped by a large picture on the wall, her company's founding photo. Everyone looked proud, smiling beside her. Her eyes stopped on the man who caused the accident years ago, the driver who killed Ethan's wife. He still worked for her company, promoted twice since the case closed. Sophie's hands curled into fists. "How many lives have I ruined? Just to protect this," she whispered, staring at the photo. She went to her office, turned on her computer, and opened old files, the accident report, the legal settlement, the signed closure document. There it was, her own digital signature at the bottom. Sophie stared at it until her vision blurred. "I signed this," she whispered. "I ended their fight for justice." Tears rolled down her cheeks. She closed the laptop and sat in silence for a long time. The sound of thunder filled the empty house. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Ethan lay awake in his small apartment. Mia had fallen asleep beside him, her hand clutching his shirt. But Ethan couldn't sleep. His mind was a storm. She was the CEO, the same company that covered up my wife's death. He got up quietly and sat by the window. The rain had started again, tapping softly against the glass. He looked out, remembering the night 2 years ago. The flashing lights, the sirens, the lifeless body of the woman he loved. He had blamed the system. He had blamed power. But never had he imagined that the same power would walk beside him one night, lost and helpless. He sighed deeply. "She didn't even know," he whispered to himself. "She was part of it. And she didn't even know." He wanted to hate her. He wanted to feel anger. But when he thought of her scared face under the streetlight, her kindness toward Mia, and the tears in her eyes before she left, something inside him stopped him. "People make mistakes," he murmured. "But can they really change?" He looked at the sleeping face of his daughter. "If I stay angry, what will she learn from me?" The next morning, Sophie didn't go to her office. She sat by the window of her study, still wearing the same clothes from the night before. Her phone buzzed non-stop, missed calls, urgent messages, emails. But she didn't touch it. She looked outside, the sun rising, the light soft and gold. And then, slowly, she made a decision. She called her assistant. "Get me the contact information for a man named Ethan Cole." "Ma'am?" "He helped me last night. I'd need to see him again." Her assistant hesitated. "Should I set up a meeting?" Sophie shook her head. "No, this is personal. I'll go myself." By evening, she was standing again at the narrow street, this time in simple clothes without her expensive car or guards. The same kids played in the corner. The same smell of rain and dust filled the air. Ethan was outside his building, fixing a small bike for Mia. When he saw her walking toward him, his expression changed, shock, confusion, and something unspoken. Sophie stopped a few feet away. "Ethan." He didn't say anything. He just stared at her, waiting. She took a deep breath. "You deserve the truth. That case, the one that took your wife. My company covered it. I signed the papers." Ethan's jaw tightened. His hands froze on the bike's handle. "I didn't know the details back then," Sophie continued, her voice shaking. "They told me it was just a minor case, that the family was compensated. But after hearing your story, I checked everything. And now I know. It was my fault too." She looked at him, tears welling up. "I can't change the past, but I don't want to hide anymore." Ethan's eyes were hard, unreadable. He looked at her for a long moment before saying, "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want to make it right," Sophie said softly. Not with money, but with truth. Mia ran to her father, holding his hand. She looked up at Sophie curiously. You came back, Miss Sophie? Sophie smiled faintly through her tears. Yes, sweetheart. I came back. Ethan looked at her, still silent. His heart was torn between anger and the strange peace he felt in her honesty. Finally, he said quietly, You can't bring her back. Sophie nodded. I know, but I can start by telling the world what really happened. Ethan sighed deeply. The night breeze brushed past them, cool and soft. He looked up at the darkening sky. If you're serious, it's going to cost you everything. Sophie nodded again. Then it's worth it. The scene ended there, the camera slowly zooming out as Sophie stood beside the man whose life her company had broken. Both of them silent, both facing the same storm that had once separated their worlds. The next morning, the world of business woke up to a storm. Sophie Turner, the powerful CEO who everyone admired for her confidence and success, had done something no one expected. She called a press conference herself. Reporters filled the big hall of her company's headquarters. Flashing lights, microphones, cameras, everything pointed at her. But this time, Sophie didn't wear her usual proud smile. Her face was calm, serious and tired, but honest. She walked to the podium, holding a file in her hand. When she started speaking, her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes didn't waver. 2 years ago, she began, a woman lost her life in an accident caused by one of our employees. That case was closed quietly, too quietly. I signed those papers without knowing the truth. But I do now, the crowd gasped. Reporters leaned forward, writing fast. I met the family of that woman by accident, Sophie continued, her voice breaking. I saw their pain. I heard their story, and I realized we failed them. I failed them. Flashes of cameras lit up the room. Questions started flying from every direction, but Sophie raised her hand. I will not hide behind excuses, she said firmly. The truth deserves to be heard, even if it costs me everything. She placed the file on the podium. This is the full report of that case, including the details our company hid from the public. I'm releasing it now. No lawyers, no filters, just the truth. Her voice softened. To the man who lost his wife, and to his daughter. I'm sorry. Then she stepped back and walked out, ignoring the reporters shouting, the flash of cameras, and the chaos that followed. The news spread like fire. CEO admits company cover-up. Sophie Turner confesses to hidden case. Justice after 2 years. Truth finally revealed. Every news channel, every social media feed, every headline had her name. Half the world admired her courage. The other half wanted her gone. The company's stock crashed. Board members called emergency meetings. And Sophie? She turned off her phone and disappeared from the noise. That evening, Ethan was sitting in his small living room when the TV caught his attention. The news reporter said, Earlier today, CEO Sophie Turner admitted her company's involvement in the case of the fatal hit-and-run accident that killed Mrs. Anna Cole. Ethan froze. He stared at the screen, at Sophie standing there, telling the truth, her eyes filled with pain and determination. Mia looked up at him and said softly, Daddy, that's Miss Sophie. Ethan didn't speak. He felt something heavy lift from his chest, a pain he'd carried for 2 years, slowly turning into something else. She told the truth, he whispered to himself. He turned off the TV and sat in silence for a long time. The rain began again, tapping gently against the windows. Just like the night he lost everything. But this time, it didn't sound as painful. The next day, Sophie received a call from her company. Ma'am, her assistant said nervously, the board wants your resignation. They said you've destroyed the company's reputation. Sophie smiled faintly. No, she said quietly. I gave it a soul. She packed her things from her office, just one box of memories. The photo of her team, a coffee mug, and a small plant she'd kept on her desk for years. Before leaving, she stood by the window looking at the city below. The same city where she had once ruled from the top, and the same city where she'd learned what humanity truly meant. When she walked out of the building, no one clapped, no one cheered. Some people stared, some whispered, but Sophie didn't care anymore. For the first time in her life, she felt free. Later that week, she went back to the neighborhood again. Ethan was sitting outside his apartment, fixing an old chair. When he saw her, he put the hammer down slowly. Sophie smiled gently. "I didn't know if you'd ever want to see me again." Ethan didn't answer at first. He just looked at her. The woman who once lived in a world of power and money, now standing in front of him quietly, like someone who'd lost everything, yet gained peace. Finally, he said, "I saw the news. You told them everything." Sophie nodded. "It was the right thing to do." Ethan leaned back, sighing. "You lost your company, didn't you?" She smiled softly. "Yes, but maybe I found something better." He looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, "You know, I wanted to hate you." Sophie looked down. "I know. But when I saw you telling the truth, I realized something," Ethan continued. "My wife always believed in forgiveness. She used to say, 'People aren't perfect, but truth makes them human.'" Sophie's eyes filled with tears. "She sounds like she was an amazing person." "She was," Ethan said, smiling sadly. "And if she were here, she'd tell me to forgive you." Sophie's breath caught in her throat. "Do you?" she asked in a whisper. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, then he nodded slowly. "Yes, I do." The silence that followed wasn't heavy anymore. It felt peaceful. Mia ran out of the door, laughing. "Miss Sophie!" She hugged Sophie tightly. "Daddy said we can invite you for dinner." Sophie laughed softly for the first time in days. "I'd love that." Ethan smiled faintly. "It's not a fancy meal, just soup and bread." Sophie smiled back. "That's perfect." That night, Sophie sat at their small wooden table, sharing a simple dinner with Ethan and Mia. The place was small, but warm. The laughter was real. For once, she didn't feel like a CEO. She didn't feel like someone powerful or broken. She just felt human. As she helped Mia with her food, she looked at Ethan and said quietly, "Thank you for forgiving me." Ethan nodded. "Thank you for giving the truth." Outside, the rain started again, soft and gentle, like a promise that life could begin again, even after everything was lost. The camera would slowly fade out here, on the three of them sitting together, the storm outside turning into peace, the sound of rain mixing with their laughter. The next morning, sunlight poured through the small window of Ethan's apartment. The smell of coffee filled the air, and soft laughter echoed from the kitchen. Sophie stood beside Mia, helping her pour milk into a cup. The little girl giggled when some of it spilled on the counter. "It's okay," Sophie said with a smile. "Accidents happen." Mia grinned. "Daddy says the same thing." Ethan, sitting at the small table, looked at them quietly. He couldn't help but smile. It felt strange. Just a few nights ago, he and Sophie were strangers. Now, somehow, it felt like she had always been a part of their small world. After breakfast, Sophie offered to help wash the dishes, but Ethan stopped her. "You've already done enough. You're our guest." Sophie shook her head. "I think I stopped being a guest the moment I walked in last night." They both smiled. Not the kind of smile that hides pain, but one that shows healing. Later that day, Sophie went outside to take a walk. The neighborhood looked different now. It wasn't scary or dark anymore. It was alive. Kids playing football in the street, a woman selling fruit, neighbors greeting each other, people who once seemed strangers now felt like faces she could recognize. She realized something deep. This was the real world. A world beyond glass buildings, boardrooms, and expensive suits. Every smile here had a story. Every person carried pain and strength together. Sophie sat on a nearby bench, watching life go by. For the first time, she felt peace, not because she had everything, but because she had learned what really mattered. Days turned into weeks. The media slowly moved on to new stories. Sophie's name appeared less and less in the news. Her company appointed a new CEO. She received dozens of calls offering her jobs in other corporations, but she refused them all. Instead, she started something different, a small foundation in the name of Ethan's late wife, the Anna Hope Fund, dedicated to helping victims of corporate injustice. She didn't want attention, fame, or headlines. She just wanted to give back, quietly, truthfully. When she told Ethan about it, he looked at her for a long moment before saying, "She would have liked that." Sophie smiled softly. "It's the least I can do." Sometimes Sophie visited Ethan and Mia in the evenings. They'd sit outside, drinking tea and talking about small things, school, life, funny stories. Mia loved showing Sophie her drawings. One evening she brought out a picture she had made, a house, a tree, and 3 stick figures holding hands under a rainbow. "That's you, Daddy, and me," Mia said proudly. Sophie laughed softly. "And who's this one?" she asked, pointing to another small figure beside them. Mia grinned. "That's you, Miss Sophie. You're part of our family now." Sophie's eyes filled with tears. She hugged Mia gently, whispering, "Thank you, sweetheart." Ethan watched them quietly, his heart warm. For years, pain had been his only companion. But now, something new had taken its place. Hope. One evening, as the sun began to set, Ethan and Sophie stood outside, watching the sky turn orange and pink. Sophie spoke softly. "You know, sometimes I still wake up and think about everything I lost. My company, my reputation. And then I come here, and I see you and Mia, and I realize I didn't lose anything. I just found a different kind of success." Ethan smiled gently. "Maybe you found life." Sophie looked at him and smiled back. "Maybe I did." They stood there in silence for a while, the kind of silence that doesn't need words. The air was peaceful. The sounds of laughter, children playing, and the distant hum of the city surrounded them. Months later, the foundation became successful. Many people came forward, inspired by Sophie's courage. She stayed humble, always crediting Ethan's story for changing her. And even though their worlds were so different, Sophie and Ethan remained close, not because of guilt or sympathy, but because of something deeper, respect, kindness, and understanding. Mia often called her Auntie Sophie now. Sometimes they'd go for ice cream together, or to the park where Mia would run ahead while Sophie and Ethan walked behind, talking quietly about life and how unpredictable it could be. One evening, as the first rain of the season began to fall, Sophie looked up at the sky and smiled. Ethan stood beside her, holding an umbrella over both of them. "She loved the rain," he said softly, thinking of his late wife. Sophie nodded. "I know. I think she's watching over you both." Mia ran toward them, laughing as the raindrops fell on her face. "Daddy, Miss Sophie, come dance in the rain." Sophie hesitated, then laughed, running after her. Ethan followed, shaking his head with a smile. For the first time in a long time, laughter filled the street again, not the laughter of power or success, but the laughter of healing. The rain poured, washing away the pain of the past, and the 3 of them stood together, a picture of forgiveness, courage, and new beginnings. The camera slowly zooms out as Sophie twirls Mia around in the rain, both laughing, while Ethan watches them with quiet joy. The music swells softly, narrator's voice, optional for YouTube ending. Sometimes the wrong road takes you to the right people, and sometimes getting lost is the only way to find yourself again. The end.